Looking forward to another week in the Wonderful Day in the Lord broadcast as we are working our way through the Psalms and just kind of looking at some of the Psalms we want to address and seeing what God has to teach us as we go through. And we're in Psalm 78 this morning. That'll be the first Psalm of the week. And it's the second longest Psalm in the entire book of Psalms, Psalm 119 being the longest by far, but this is the second longest. So we're going to hit some highlights here. Much of it's very repetitive anyway. As you read through it, you'll see a lot of the same ideas coming back over and over. But the main thrust of the book is this, or this chapter is this. The people of Israel need to be reminded of who they are and what God has done for them. They have a tendency to forget what God has done, and every time they forget what God has done for them and who God is and who they are, they go in a downward spiritual spiral that ends up in disaster one way or the other. That's been the history of Israel over and over throughout all the Old Testament, and this psalm is kind of a reminder of that for them. He wants them to remember certain things, and he's going to catalog their history and look at these things. But right now, we'll start with the first few verses. He's getting their attention. He says in verse 1, "Listen, O my people, to my instruction. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us." These are things that you've known. They've been passed down to you, and these are things I want to remind you of. But they're forgetting these things, and so he's going to rehearse some of their history and some of the ways that God has worked with them. But before he does that, he wants to tell them what the fathers have told them. They need to tell their own children. They need to pass that on. This is where the link is missing in the people of Israel. He says in verse 4, "We will not conceal them from their children, but tell to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wondrous works that he has done." So we need to tell our children that. We go on down in verse 5, and he says that they should teach them to their children, that the generation to come might know, even the children yet to be born, that they may rise and tell them to their children. They should put confidence in God and not forget the works of God, but to keep his commandments. And so he's saying, look, you got to pass this on. That goes all the way back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, when the Lord commanded the people of Israel to tell their children these things, the ways of God, the commandments of God, throughout their lives, in the daily walk of life and so forth. You must pass this on generation after generation. And so he's telling them to do that here. But unfortunately, they tend to forget, and that comes with consequences. Verse 10, "But they did not keep the covenant of God and refused to walk in his ways, and they forgot his deeds and his miracles that he had shown them." So one of the things he's saying here is the reason why your fathers have failed so often is because they have forgotten the wondrous works of God and all that he's done. And so if we have forgotten what God has done, we're not going to pass it on to our children, right? And so we have to be diligent, and we have to remember. The fathers had forgotten, and they did not pass that on. They did not even remember what God had done. Well, the rest of the chapter deals a great deal with what God had done and what they had forgotten and how they had sinned. But we go over to verse 10 and 11 here for just a moment. We've seen verse 10 and 11. Go to verse 39 and notice that even though they have failed God, God does understand the weakness of their flesh. This is an encouraging verse to us who fail the Lord at times. He says, verse 39, "Thus he remembered that they were but flesh, a wind that passes and does not return." So he knew their weaknesses, and he understood those weaknesses. And he says in verse 40, even though they continued to rebel. In verse 72, as we close out the psalm, it says, "So he shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart and guided them with his skillful hands." So this psalm is rehearsing a lot of failure on the part of Israel, who had forgotten the goodness of God and therefore had drifted into sin. They were not passing along the things that God had done. And so he's reminding them, don't do what your people have done in the past. Remember the ways of God. Pass them on to your children. But the good news is this: whatever we have done, whatever Israel had done, God had not changed. God understood our weaknesses. He often compensated for those weaknesses. And as verse 72 tells us, he continued to shepherd them, even though they often refused to follow his leadership. That's a kind of loving God that we have. Even in our weaknesses and failures, he continues to guide and shepherd and love his people. What a God we have.